Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. We've been trained to look at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as competing creation stories, trained to see the differences in them, trained to prefer one over the other. And on the surface, they are very different. In Genesis 1, God speaks creation into existence, while in Genesis 2, God molds living things with their hands, forming the first person and the animals out of the clay of the ground. And the order in which things are created is different in the two. But are these really significant differences? After all, it's not as though choosing one or the other will impact our understanding of how the universe operates. And unless you're deeply invested in the idea that women were created to be subservient to men, there aren't significant theological differences between the two. In both creation stories, God is the actor who sets in motion the process of creation and who guides it along its way. And in both creation stories, God places creation in the care of humanity. So what happens if we read both stories together? How do we understand ourselves as God's creatures? We are created in the image of God, filled with the Spirit, and created from the fertile soil of the earth, called to serve and protect God's creation. Genesis 1 presents a poetic image of creation filled with a profound inherent goodness, and Genesis 2 shows us the complexities and ambiguities of what it means to live within this creation. Most of chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3 are where we find ourselves on this God's Work, Our Hands Sunday, this first Sunday in the third cycle of the narrative lectionary. And we see the way God calls us to be co-laborers in creation. Our text begins in a state of pre-creation. The earth exists, but nothing exists on it or in it. Why is this? Partly because God has not yet caused it to rain, but also because no one lives yet who can care for the land. Rain and human labor are both indispensable for the earth to be productive and creative. And so we see God creating the first creature. And there's a phrase that repeats itself, although our text translates it slightly differently each time. In verse 7, God creates the first earth creature from the ground. And again in verse 9, God causes every kind of tree and plant to grow from the ground. And again in verse 19, God forms every kind of animal from the ground. We are all, humans and animals, created from the ground. Nefesh Hayah, living creatures, literally soul of life. In God's reign, more things unite us with the rest of creation than divide us. With the placement of the first person in the garden, God calls us to serve and protect creation, to be stewards on God's behalf. The verb that's translated care for in our text this morning in verse 15 can also be translated keep, as in the Lord bless you and keep you. As Jewish theology and law developed over time, this word developed the legal connotation of being a guardian, being legally responsible for maintaining the land and being liable if it is harmed or if losses occur. That's a big responsibility that Adam has been given. But it doesn't end there. God recognizes that aloneness is not good, and so the animals are created. And God parades them before Adam, giving him naming rights. There are no boundaries, no parameters that God sets on this work. God delegates all power and authority to Adam to name each animal, trusting that he has an objective understanding of what God's will for creation is, and that he will follow it. Something happens when you name something. You form a relationship. The thing stops being a thing and becomes a creature with feelings, motivations, anxieties, and joys. We see it happen when kids name their stuffed animals and endow these stuffed animals with personalities. We see it happen with our pets when we name them, and then we begin to see their individuality, their particular quirks and ways of letting us know when they are scared, when they need attention, when they're hungry, when they're happy. But as much as we love our pets, as much as we love our gardens and caring for creation, God recognized that we need companionship that is like us, of the same species. And so God creates a second person, two halves of a whole, created to work together to help and support each other in this work that God has called us to do. And in the beginning, Adam and Eve recognize that they are made in God's image, and they rejoice in this. But there are other forces at work in the garden. God has not created automatons to do God's will. Instead, God has created beings who are capable of making choices, even choices that God would prefer they not make. If we didn't have the capacity to make choices, we wouldn't have the imagination that makes it possible for us to do God's work in the world, serving and protecting creation and continuing the creative process started by God. Until now, we've skipped over any mention of the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God has planted them in the garden and has warned Adam not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil on pain of death. Adam has been given a choice and been told of the consequences. God has created a world where choices matter. God has created a world where people are capable of rational thought and can make their own decisions. But in warning a person who is capable of making choices not to do a thing, God creates a situation in which that person has agency to decide whether to heed the warning or not. This is just human nature. Those of you who have kids, how many times did you warn them not to touch something hot or not to stick their tongue on something freezing? And how many times did they do it anyway? In the garden, when God creates the first person and gives that person the responsibility to care for the land and the responsibility to name and care for the animals, God knows that humanity inherently understands the difference between right and wrong in what we can call an objective way. That is to say, God knows that humanity inherently understands what choices align with God's plan for creation and what choices run counter to God's plan for creation. But then along comes the snake, this creature that is a metaphor for anything that presents humanity with options that are outside of God's desires for us. The snake is not inherently bad. It is a creature like any other, created to be a part of God's creation. But the snake is cunning, playing on the fact that humans are exposed to temptation. And so, in what appears to be an ongoing theological conversation, the snake asks Eve whether God really forbade her and Adam from eating of any of the trees in the garden. Now, we know when someone asks a question that seems like a distortion or a magnification of the truth, they're driving towards something. They have an ulterior motive of some sort. And unless we're very savvy to what they're doing and willing to cut the conversation short, it's almost impossible to just reply with a yes or no. The snake is playing on Eve's vulnerability and naivete, gambling that she'll try to correct the snake's statement, and she plays right into it. And so the snake, playing the devil's advocate, says they won't die if they eat of the fruit of the tree. Instead, they'll be like gods, knowing the difference between good and evil. The snake knows that once Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the only way they'll live is to eat of the tree of life. But the snake doesn't point that out. Who knows why Eve and Adam succumbed to temptation? Maybe the duty to care for all of creation is beginning to weigh a little heavily on them with no one else to help them. Or maybe the snake leads them to wonder what God was hiding from them, whether God has lied to them out of some self-serving desire to keep them ignorant of parts of creation. Or maybe, being newly created beings, they are just short-sighted enough not to realize that it takes time to become wise. God never intended for them not to acquire wisdom, but God understands that it takes time and experience to gain the wisdom to discern on your own which choices align with God's desires for creation and which don't. They may not understand that yet. So the sin, if we can call it that, is not in gaining knowledge and wisdom. It's in choosing to doubt God. It's in deciding not to trust what God has told them. The sin is in choosing to disobey God's command. And in doing so, they radically altered their perception of themselves and the world. They had been living in a world with God at the center, with God's love for creation, the determining factor of right and wrong. Now, all of a sudden, they believe they live in a world where they are at the center, the most valuable part of creation, the axis around which all decisions revolve, the center of knowledge. But in doing so, they separate themselves from God and the ground that brought them into being. Humanity has always known good from evil, but that doesn't mean that we always make the right decision, or even that we always have the capacity to choose correctly. We sometimes choose wrong. We have a tendency to want what we don't have, to want to be what we're not. And so we find ourselves doubting God's promise to empower us to continue the project of creation. We find ourselves doubting whether we are all truly made in God's image, or whether we are capable of doing what God has asked us to do. But on this God's Work Our Hands Sunday, with choices surrounding us that will impact how humanity cares for creation and for each other, we are reminded that we are made in God's image, filled with God's breath, formed from the fertile soil of the earth, and called to serve and protect the land and each other. And we are reminded that there is a difference between being created in God's image and in seeking to become God. One leads to human possibility, and the other leads to despair. May we make choices that support human possibility and the project of creation. Amen.